The session is presented by DNA. We have Vikram Chandra, introduced by James Mallinson. So let's welcome Vikram and James on stage for the session, The Wonder of Pāṇini's Sanskrit Grammar, presented by DNA.
Good morning, everyone. It's my honor and gives me great pleasure to be introducing Vikram Chandra to you, who I'm sure needs little introduction. He's probably best known at the moment as the author of Sacred Games, a novel which has been turned into a...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. We're looking for a clicker.
We had some slides that we need to show.
I'll get you the slider also.
Small technical hitch there. We're just looking for the slide flicker. So yeah, at the moment, you may well be aware of the Netflix series Sacred Games, a fantastic TV series which is based on one of Vikram's novels, Sacred Games. He's written other novels. The first one's Red Earth and Pouring Rain, a wonderful collection of short stories about Bombay. Is it Love and Longing in Bombay? But he also, and as in his capacity as an author, he teaches creative writing at Berkeley in California. But he also has a sideline, a hobby as well, not just a hobby, as a Sanskrit aficionado. And I last saw Vikram in July in Vancouver at the World Sanskrit Conference, where he gave a wonderful presentation on Chitrakavya, which are these very ornate, intricate Sanskrit poems. And he's also written a book called Geek Sublime, talking about computer programming and the Sanskrit language. And today he's going to be talking to us about Pāṇini. Okay, and I'm not going to say too much about Pāṇini, but I'm a Sanskrit teacher at SOAS, the University of London, and so as a Sanskritist, I often get asked or even told things about Sanskrit, somewhat controversial things. People might say it's the oldest language ever, or that it's it's the language of the gods, and these are perhaps matters of belief and can maybe disputed. But what is indisputable is what makes Sanskrit absolutely unique and totally special is Pāṇini. I won't say any more why, because I think Vikram will be explaining why to us. And before he starts, also, I should just say that we're very, very lucky to have him here, not just because of his brilliance, but also because he's not very well and he's been suffering for the last couple of days. He's got a terrible fever and the rest. So hopefully he can make it through, and that's why he's not going to be standing up through this. So thank you very much for turning up, coming along.
Thank you, Jim. And like he said, I've dosed up on antibiotics, so I hope I make sense. I'm feeling a little delirious. So, is it on? Ah, okay. Great, thank you. So I should say I am absolutely not a Sanskritist. Probably like many of you, I had 2 years of Sanskrit in middle school, and then I ran away from it as quickly as I could because it was taught in this incredibly boring manner, which I resented. Although, but in my old age, I've started taking lessons, and I'm slowly struggling with the help of my very patient tutor through the Panchatantra. But that is the level of my understanding. So what you should think of me is as a kind of analog to one of those science reporters who takes other people's research and tries to bring it to a larger audience. So the story of Pāṇini, to understand who Pāṇini was and where he came from and what he did, we actually have to go back maybe 1,000 years before his assumed date. So as you all know, the oldest Sanskrit texts that are available to us are the Vedas, the oldest of which is the Rig Veda, dating to perhaps about 2000 BCE to 1700 BCE. And the Vedic universe was set around the concept of sacrifice, yajna. And you've seen, I'm sure, in contemporary settings as well, the Vedic priests throwing ablutions into Agni, the fire. What we have, for the most part now, are actually very small versions of these sacrifices that could, in the old days, go on for anywhere from 12 to 17 days, involve as many as 17 different types of priests. The Agni Chayana, which is one of the famous sacrifices, was filmed by Fritz Stahl in 1975, if I'm remembering correctly, and they took 12 days to complete a very shortened version of the sacrifice. So despite all of this enormous expenditure in human effort and resources, what is interesting about the Vedas is it's the language that makes the sacrifice effective, right? So it's the chanting of the Vedic hymns that is crucial. So the Shatapatha Brahmana, which dates to about 1000 BCE, tells us this in very uncertain terms. All the rituals performed in the sacrifice, all that are linked to the rite, all this was performed in and by speech on what was speech made and speech gathered and consisted only of speech, right? So it's the Vedic, the sound of the mantras being chanted, of the shlokas being chanted, that has the power in it. There was also a huge concern with taking these Vedic hymns and transmitting them from generation to generation so that there would be no slippage, there would be no corruption as it was passed on. And the ancient Vedic people developed extraordinarily sophisticated error-checking mechanisms to make sure that not only the words themselves, but the tones and the pitch and the meter was passed down without corruption from generation to generation. And from what we can tell, this has been successfully done for 4,000 years now. So because the language itself, which is the cosmic hum, the sound of creation itself, with certain very advanced rishis or munis, men and women, are able to hear in deep meditation, they translate it for us into human speech, which is to say Sanskrit, and there was an enormous amount of effort, intellectual effort, devoted towards preserving the Veda. So I hope this makes sense, that in this universe, the universe itself is made up and sustained and created by language itself, right? So I'm sure a lot of you know of the idea of Shabda Brahman, whereas sound itself is the creator and the sustainer of the universe. Right? So because of all of this concern with preserving it carefully, what quickly developed in the second millennium BCE were a bunch of Vedangas. These are auxiliary sciences which one has to practice in order to understand what the Vedas are and what they do. The second one, Kalpa ritual, is the one that also deals with the construction of the sometimes very elaborate Vedic altars on which the sacrifices were done, which involved transformation of plane figures with very precise calculations of sizes and distances. So there's some theorization that Indian mathematics actually grew out of this as well, right, out of this ritual universe. But notice that 4 out of those 6 are devoted to language, right? So we've got phonetics, meter, grammar, and etymology, right? Again, what you see there is the enormous concern for language and its preservation and for understanding of language itself. So it's in the field of Vyakarana, of grammar, that somewhere around 500 BCE, a man named Pāṇini publishes this extraordinary document, text called the Ashtadhyayi, 8 chapters. And when I say grammar, the usual impulse is to understand that word as a kind of prescriptive grammar, right? So if you're of my age, you remember those horrible Whitney and Strunk grammars which they tried to make us use to learn English, right? This is not what we are talking about. So Parnini's grammar is actually a rule engine. It consists, along with some other auxiliary texts, of 3,976 rules, right? Which he uses, as we'll see, to describe and to generate Sanskrit, as it were. So we'll get to the rules in a moment. There are a bunch of associated texts that go along with the Ashtadhyayi. And we'll take a look at a couple of these. The first one being the Shiva Sutra, which is the recitation of phonemes. Phonemes being the smallest unit of sound that can be distinguishable within a language. And so what the Shiva Sutras are is a simple, seemingly simple listing of all the phonemes of the Sanskrit language, right? So it's just 14 of these, but there's some incredibly ingenious stuff that is hidden in this Shiva Sutra. So you'll notice that some of those letters at the end of each sutra are italicized and colored red in this slide. Those are actually part of Pāṇini's meta language. And what I mean by that is that these are special markers which are not part of the phonemes, but which he is using in a particular way. And the manner in which he is using this is that if somebody says, if in the rules Pāṇini uses the term ach, what the user is supposed to do is to start with the sound a, which is in that first line, and then start collecting phonemes, as it were, until you get to a, o, cha, right? And so you make a little list out of these. And then what you do is you take out all the red letters that you've collected along the way, right? And so what you're left with is a set a, I, u, ri, ri, e, o, I, o. Anybody recognize those? What are those? They're all the vowels of the Sanskrit language, right? So similarly, so ach is all the vowels, and then you can form other combinations here as well, so that hal is all the consonants, jhash is voiced consonants, you've got voiced aspirated consonants, and yan is the semi-vowels, right? So this is incredibly clever, right? And it allows, as we'll see, Pāṇini to refer to sets of these sounds within the rules without having to repeat these sounds time and time over again. So there are many hundreds of these pratyaharas, set denoters, that are possible from the Shiva Sutra, but Pāṇini uses 43 of them in the rule set. So an example might make it more clear as to how he uses this. So rule number 6.1.77 is Iko Yarn Achi. And we might translate that as ik is replaced by yarn if ach follows, right? That's what the rule says. So we already know that ach is vowels. So what he's actually saying is ik is replaced by yarn if a vowel follows. Now if we go back and do our set denotation, we extract our set. What he's then said is those 4 letters in the first set are replaced by ya, va, ra, la if a vowel follows. Right? Like that. So this is, it blows my mind that somebody in 500 BCE was doing these kinds of partially ordered set replacements in a matrix, right? And he uses these throughout the text of the Ashtadhyayi, throughout the rule set of the Ashtadhyayi. So there have been a couple of interesting research papers published recently about this. Paul Kiparsky argues that for what Pāṇini is trying to do for his linguistic purposes, the Shiva Sutra is optimized perfectly. And then more recently, I should have shown you that first. Wiebke Peterson argued that it is also mathematically optimized, right? So that this is the shortest combination of letters possible to achieve what Pāṇini is going to do with these in the Shivas, in the Ashtadhyayi's rule set itself. Right? So one of the secondary texts that we should also look at is the Dhatu Pata. So this is a list of verbal roots. And so the verbal roots are things out of which you can make verbs or nouns out of. The first one in this listing of verbal roots, which has 1,943 verbal roots, is Bhu Sattayam, which is appropriate enough. Bhu in the sense of existence, right? And then any a speaker of a modern Indian language will recognize some of these other roots, right? Like Rud for weep, Lik for writing, Pat for reading, and so forth. And then along with the Dhatu Pata, one also has a Ganapatha, which is an ordered listing of sets of nominal stems, which is to say things that which you can make nouns out of. And this part of some of these lists are open-ended, right? So the Dhatu Pata's listing of verb roots is complete and you can't change it, but here some of these lists are open-ended. So this is probably the most open part of Pāṇini's system. And there was a great tradition later of creating new listings or adding or extending these listings. So an example of one of these nominal roots would be kram, from which we can form utkram to step up, vyutkram to go apart, padakrama, a series of steps, pace walking, right? So you take a little component, a nominal stem, and then by adding affixes or suffixes to it, you can create other words, right? So now we've got what you might consider are all the building blocks of language, right? You have sounds, phonemes, you have verb roots, and you have nominal roots. But before we get to how Pāṇini uses these in his rule set, there's a couple of other wonderful things about the Ashtadhyayi itself which I should tell you about. And the first one of these is Anuvritti, which the English translation would be rule ellipses. Now, if you look at those three sentences, give Chaitra a cow, a blanket to Maitra, also to Gopal, what you'll notice is that that very last sentence kind of borrows semantic meaning from the two sentences that have gone before it, right? And the second one, a blanket to Maitra, doesn't make sense if you don't include give from the first sentence, right? In the sense of that sentence, right? So these are elliptical sentences. So Pāṇini uses this kind of elliptical inheritance, I guess you could call it, throughout the rules of the Ashtadhyayi. So Sutra number 3.3.645 is very typically short. Pāṇini's rules rarely go over 2 or 3 words, right? And that seems like a very succinct formulation, but in order to understand what he's actually saying is that you have to go to the sutras above it and borrow what preceded it. And so if we extend the entire shloka and fill out all the ellipses, what we get is a much longer text, right? And this borrows meaning from 11 sutras that go above it, right? So again, there's this enormous emphasis on compression, on economy, right? And brilliantly done. A lot of modern programmers will recognize a kind of familial resemblance with object-oriented programming with inheritance in there, right? So that you have something that doesn't need to be repeated because it's already considered to be part of the meaning of this particular sutra. And there is no limit, apparently, in Pāṇini's text of how many times anuvritti can be used. So famously, there is one shloka that uses the word it, and that then is taken, included in 70 sutras below it, right? So when you're working with the Ashtadhyayi's rule set, you kind of have to have this whole mess, or whole sort of hierarchical descent of information that is extending from sutra to sutra within the text itself. So Dr. Amba Kulkarni, who is a computer scientist and a Sanskritist, points out that the number of words with sandhi, which is to say word combination, in the entirety of the Ashtadhyayi's rule set are 7,007 words. And then if you take all those combined words and you draw them apart, you're left with 9,843 words. But if you expand all the anuvritti throughout the text, you get 40,000 words, right? So what he manages to achieve through this technique is a compression of 6:1, right? So again, this extraordinary concern for very scientifically and ingeniously reducing the level of the number of words, but packing the most dense amount of information into each word or sentence as you possibly can, right? So finally, we get to the rules in the Ashtadhyayi itself. There are actually 9 types of rules, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with another huge wall of text. So I've listed the 6 most important ones here. So we get technical rules, which assign names. We get interpretive rules or meta rules, which govern the performance by other rules. You get heading rules from which anuvritti happens, right? So those are the originators of anuvritti. You get niyama, condition or restriction rules, which restrict the scope of a given rule. And you get extension rules, rules which expand the scope of a given rule, usually by allowing the transfer of certain properties which otherwise are not available, right? So what you have is this intricate typology of rules which all work with each other in an incredibly complex way to produce language, right? And the rules which actually do the transformation of sound units or words are vidhi, the operational rules. And the way that the operational rules work are usually stated is that what he usually says, as we saw in Iko Yarn Achi, what he's saying is that when there is a left context and appears directly before E, which is the word or the phoneme that is being affected by it, E is replaced by X, right? So these are string transformation rules. As any programmer here will recognize, it will instantly make a connection with string functions, right? So what you do is you put a sound or a word into one of these rules, and it somehow changes the sound of the rules, as we saw with Iko Yarn Achi. So I know this is all heavily abstract and is probably making your brain spin right now. So a practical example of this might be helpful. So we have the verb root, bhu. Remember, this was the first in the dhatu pata. So if you're a Pāṇinian linguist and you want to take this verb root and use it to construct a word, a noun, that means any internal state of being, consciousness, emotion, how would you do it, right? How do you get from bhu as a verb root to something as a noun that has that meaning? Well, what you do is you start applying rules to the original sound, and each time you apply a rule, something is changed about the original sound that you started with, right? And so what happens is that you go from bhu to bhugna to bhu-a, and you go further and it becomes bhau-a, and finally you get bhav, right? When speakers of contemporary Indian languages will recognize this word, right? Bhava, right? So although I should say that in the grammarian's strict universe, bhav is still not a word. It is the potential of a word. In Parninis universe, the only time that something actually translates and becomes an actual word is when it is put into the conceptual structure of a sentence, right? And Pāṇini shows us how to do this within the Ashtadhyayi. And so what would happen is that once you've figured out what a speaker is trying to say, you construct the conceptual structure of the sentence, and then certain rules come into application, and those rules are then transform the word, the bhav into, you apply case to it, you apply gender to it, you apply number to it, you apply what Pāṇini calls karakas, which are case categories, and finally then you end up with a phrase or a sentence like bhavena dhridam krit, having made his sentiments or his emotions firm, right? So at that point, bhavena is the word that has resulted in this rule application starting with bhu. I hope this makes some kind of sense, right? So it's a rule-driven operation. All these rules are deterministic, which is to say that if you plug in one input into a rule, it will only produce one specific output, right? Rules can call each other recursively. There is a very rigid order in which the rules are applied. The application of one rule to a form can result in many other rule applications being demanded, and then the operation only stops when there are no more rules left to run on the input, right? So what he's doing here is actually then, in a sense, generating language, right? Out of verb roots and nominal roots and the karakas. So what happens here with this is Sanskrit then attains this unique nature of spoken, written language that actually has a complete formal description contained with this insanely compressed rule set. You can print the entire thing out in 40 pages of text, right? If you put one rule on one line, right? So what we then get is this is the time at which this language, once Pāṇini's done his work, is now referred to as Sanskrit. Pāṇini actually doesn't name the language that he's working with in the Ashtadhyayi, right? But after Pāṇini, it gets called Sanskritam, right? And so Sanskrit literally is a descriptor, right? It comes from the root sam and kri, to make, do, perform. So the implication being that Sanskrit, what you're calling Sanskrit, is a language that is put together, well-formed, highly wrought, perfected, right? So it's unique among human languages in having this quality to it. Linguists in the 19th and 20th centuries tried to figure out comparable generative rule sets for other languages in Asia, in Europe, everywhere, and nobody's ever been able to do it. Other languages are much messier, right? Their rule structures are incredibly confusing, often full of contradiction, right? And as any of you who've tried to learn English from scratch, as I did, you can recall the frustration of those days where, like, you know, why can you say this and not this, right? And the answer is, it's just conventional, right? So here, there is no convention. There are only rules. If you apply the rules, you get a grammatically correct Sanskrit sentence or phrase, right? So it's all dependent on the operations of Pāṇini's rules. So the West discovers Pāṇini's work in the early 19th century, and it has a huge influence on modern linguistics. So the guy on the left with the fancy hipster mustache, that is de Saussure, the famous structuralist philosopher and theoretician. What most of you might not, of us who know about him, might not know is that he was a Sanskrit professor, right? And so there is an intriguing amount of similarity between his ideas and the ideas of the Indian grammatical tradition that went before him. On the right there, we have Leonard Bloomfield, who's the father of American structural linguistics. And he was deeply steeped in Parnini's work. Also a Sanskrit professor, he taught Sanskrit, and his own research he conducted with very specifically and very explicit Parninian influence. And as he says, that around the beginning of the 19th century, that's when Europe first learned of Parninis Rules. And it was from this model that Western scholars learned in the course of a few decades to describe a language in terms of its own structure. Paul Kiparsky, who's a linguist at Stanford, says that Western grammatical theory has been influenced by Parnini's work at every stage of development for the last 2 centuries, and that is absolutely true. The man at the left is Roman Jakobson, who's sometimes called the father of phonetics, and the influence on him is also very clear how much he took from Parnini's system, especially in the in morphology, in how phonemes are changed when they're used with other phonemes or words. The fellow at the bottom right over there is Noam Chomsky, who is sometimes called the father of generative linguistics. Now, his relationship to Pāṇini is a very strange one. He denies that he knew of Pāṇini when he began his work in the 1950s, and in 1951 published his first very influential thesis on generative morphology, right, on generative grammar. It's been pointed out, not just by me, but by many other scholars, that this doesn't sound very plausible, right? For one reason, his mentor and teacher was an American linguist named Zelig Harris, who was a direct student of Leonard Bloomfield's, right? And that there's no way that he could have helped Zelig Harris with his research work and not learned about this prior ancient tradition. So, I mean, I'm very skeptical. And the way that Chomsky tries to explain this idea that he never knew about Pāṇini's work is like these weird explanations about how in 1951 everyone was so disgusted with the Second World War that nobody was looking at European journals in the United States, which is where Bloomfield published one of his most influential papers on structural linguistics using explicitly Pāṇinian systems. So there's a little bit of an academic controversy if you're interested in these kinds of things. Over here, as a writer, I think what I really feel strongly is there's a lot of anxiety of influence going on here, and an effort to sort of, in retrospect, say that I was the great genius who invented this, right? Because, I mean, it's not such a big deal. If he indeed, and as I believe he did, knew about the work of, perhaps not Pāṇini, but of Bloomfield and Harris, he's not being the father of modern generative grammar. He's standing on the shoulder of giants, right, as we all do. Anyway, let's move on. So a couple of interesting things happen about, because of the formal description of the Sanskrit language in Pāṇini's work, is that, as Paul Kiparsky and Gerald Penn point out here, is that not even a single one of the standard Chomskyan systems, which is to say modern linguistic systems, can produce very accurately a single parse for us in a language like English, right? So if I'm remembering right, if the English sentence, she ate, sorry, I'm going to remember, I'm getting a little derailed, so I'm going to forget. She ate Wednesday, on Wednesday, she ate spinach salad with a fork. If you try and parse that, you actually produce something like 41 different parses, right? And so what in other languages you have to do in order to deal with this problem is that you have to apply statistical methods to actually produce a parse, right? The most probable accurate parse. So when you say to Siri, get me to town, what Apple is doing behind the scenes is they're applying huge numerically based statistical methods of trying to figure out what you actually mean, right? But in Sanskrit, that doesn't happen. And so as Kiparsky and Penn put it, the most amazing fact about the Ashtadhyayi is not that it produces so many correct derivations at all, but that it simultaneously avoids very many incorrect ones, right? So a single grammatically correct sentence of Sanskrit will only produce one parse, right? So it's a single parse, right? Because of the specificity and the accuracy of the derivation methods of the Ashtadhyayi, right? So I think it's because of this this particular unique feature about Sanskrit that leads some of us, and I think often it's Indians in nativist or full-out nationalist mode, to say things like Sanskrit should be used to program computers, right? Because what you're then saying is that it's syntactically really precise, right? It's a kind of silly claim, actually, because it doesn't understand what programming languages actually are and what they're intended to do, right? So for one thing, producing a parsing-friendly version subset of English or any other modern language hasn't really been a problem in computing since the 1950s when Fortran and COBOL were invented, right? And now it's, with modern tooling, it's a trivial process. You could probably produce a programming language, a sort of primitive but functional one, in maybe a half hour, 40 minutes, right? By putting together certain rules, right? The other more distracting or oblivious thing in that assertion that Sanskrit should be used to a programming language is that what a programming language needs to do is to unambiguously pass instructions to a computing machine. And Sanskrit, in its native, natural, spoken and written form, is no different from other languages in that the meaning of a sentence is actually quite hard to pin down, right? It's as ambiguous, and this is as any other language, and this is not only because of the huge number of synonyms and homonyms that are present in the Sanskrit lexicon, but also because language is slippery in terms of meaning. And the Indian tradition of linguists and philosophers and artists always knew this. And the favorite example they had to point this out was this seemingly simple sentence: the sun has set, right? So it can only mean one thing, right? The sun has set. Well, not really. So there's an 11th century linguist and philosopher who pointed out when the sun has set is said by a general to the king, what it can mean, now is the opportunity to attack the enemy. When said by the confidant to the girl in love, you should set forth to meet your lover. And he goes on for about 10 of these examples, ending with, when said by an impatient girl waiting for her beloved's return from a journey, it can mean, my love has not come even today, right? And then he remarks, the denoted meaning of a word is one and the same for all persons bearing it, so it is fixed and uniform, but its suggested meaning varies with the variation in such accessory conditions as the context, the character of the speaker. Thus, in fact, there is no end to the number of suggested meanings, right? So you all recognize this, right? How heavily meaning is on context, right? On who's speaking to whom, right? And in fact, the prime Indian theory of aesthetic beauty in language is built around this idea of suggested meaning, which the philosophers call dhvani, dhvani as in reverberation, which is often compared to you drop a stone into a pond and watch the endless ripple of meaning spread across, right? And so what poets do is produce a kind of directed ambiguity, and so that you can read one shloka or one sher and keep finding new meanings in it for years after years, decades after decades, right? So natural Sanskrit, as it were, doesn't really have any advantages over any other language in terms of telling computers what to do. Now, we should also note that there were certain people within the Indian tradition who were frustrated enough by this inherent quality of language, the ambiguity of language, that they actually created Shastric Sanskrits, right, paribhashas, in order to get away from this ambiguity, right? So one could argue that Pāṇini's own meta-language, which we've just seen in use, is one such paribhasha. It's a restricted Sanskrit, right? Algebraic in form, as it were, that allows him to describe what he's trying to describe. There were the school of reason and the school Navya Nyaya, the new reason from 1100 CE forwards, they developed one of these restricted languages. And so in their Shastric Sanskrit, Rama gives money to a Brahmin with his hands would become an activity of giving characterized by the agenthood in Rama, the instrumentness in the hand, the recipientness in a Brahmin, and the objecthood in money, right? So then you have no ambiguity, right? When you're using this kind of formal, restricted Sanskrit, right? Dr. Amba Kulkarni points out that one of the advantages that these kind of Shastric Sanskrits have over other modern experiments in producing non-ambiguous languages, like OWL or RDF, which are used on the web a lot, is that this is very closely aligned with natural Sanskrit, as it were, right? So that it affords you non-ambiguity and clarity, but it also gives you the suppleness of a spoken language, right? So I don't know, in my fantasies, I sometimes think that if somebody created a Shastric Sanskrit for computing, that could be really effective, right? But you would have to produce that, and I don't think, given the economic and the political realities of today and the dominance of English as the lingua franca of computing across the globe, that I think this is going to remain in the realm of fantasy. So despite this, I think we could reasonably argue that at least one person did program in Sanskrit, right? And Gerard Houet, who's a computer scientist, linguist, mathematician, at the first International Sanskrit Computational Linguistics Symposium in 2007, he made this claim, not only Pāṇini was by far the first linguist in recorded history, but I claim he was the first computer scientist 24 centuries before computers came into existence. So how is he able to claim this, and why does he say this? There's been a couple of recent papers by John Kadvani which show us how this might be. So what Kadvani says is that what Pāṇini produced was actually a Turing-complete language in his meta-language of the Ashtadhyayi, right? So most of us, when we think of computation, we've been trained by the media to think of it as a mechanical operation, right? So if you saw that Turing movie, you see those little levers going up and down and things spinning and electricity happening, right? And the word Turing machine implicitly implies that computation is mechanical. But this is not true. Those of you who are computer scientists here will remember that Alfonso Church created the lambda calculus in the 1930s. And what he showed was that merely through the application of mathematical functions, you could actually describe computation as well. And then finally, there was a man named Emil Post who demonstrated, starting in the 1920s, although he didn't publish until the 1941, that you could have recursive string writing produce computation. That sounds really weird, but it actually is true. You don't need mechanical systems to produce computation. You can just take strings and rewrite them recursively, and have anything that a computer can do now actually be produced by the same, what he called the production rewrite systems. And so what Kadvani is saying here is that the basic claim then is that Parnini's system is sufficiently structured to qualify as the earliest known computing language, right? Which is pretty mind-blowing. Although one should be absolutely clear, Pāṇini nor his intellectual descendants used this meta language to program anything but English, but Sanskrit itself, right? But nevertheless, it is, I find Kadvani's argument quite convincing. So I'm very happy to claim Pāṇini as the originator of computation. So this was a stamp produced by the Indian Postal Department in 2004. It shows, curiously, Pāṇini writing. And it's not quite clear whether they used epigraphical methods in this incredibly complex system. Certainly, the huge emphasis on economy would suggest that they were working within a largely oral universe, although they still, they knew of writing, right? Remember the verb roots pat and lik, right? But it's a largely oral universe that he exists in, and if you're a computer programmer, this should make you slightly nauseous, the thought of somebody producing something this intricate and this subtle without modern debugging tools and even without writing itself, right? On the Indian tradition itself, there's a huge influence of Pāṇini's work. One is the emphasis on economy. So all of us know what a sutra is, right? It's a very short technical statement, but what many of us might not know that there is actually a formal description of what makes a good sutra. So it should have the least number of syllables, should contain no doubtful words, no redundancy of words, should contain no meaningless words, and should be faultless, right? So this is coming directly from Pāṇini. All Indian scientific writing or philosophical writing after this, all of those writings aspire to the condition of the Ashtadhyayi, right? In its completeness, in its economy. And so the other big sort of result of Pāṇini's intervention is the way that he structures the Ashtadhyayi, is that the first 5 chapters of the Ashtadhyayi are devoted to decomposition, right? To taking apart, right? So that you take a system and you break it down into its smallest units, right? Phonemes, verb roots, nominal roots. And then last 3 chapters are devoted to synthesis, which is to say that you take those elements and you put them back together. You put them back together to make sentences, to make words, right? So what you will notice if you read Indian philosophy, if you read Indian science, that all of them are focused or work with this idea of systems thinking, right? In order to understand anything, you have to break it into its component parts. You have to understand how those component parts work together, and then you can understand the system itself and perhaps influence the system, right? And so Bhartrihari, another magnificent grammarian from the 5th century, argued, this grammar is the door of liberation, an antidote against the faults of speech. It purifies every form of knowledge. It shines forth in every kind of knowledge. Now, that's kind of a weird statement, right? That grammar can be a door to liberation, right? Especially if you're a high school teacher, you might be wondering how that makes sense, right? But if we think for a couple of minutes about what Vyakarana actually means, it starts to make sense. The literal meaning of that word is merely analysis, right? Taking apart and putting back together, right? So therefore then, within the Indian knowledge production universe, grammar or systems thinking becomes the door to liberation, because whatever the system is, if it's a language, if it's a political system, if it's a society, or even if it's existence itself, if you can understand its component parts, you can break it down, and then if you can put it all back together and understand how it works, then perhaps you can aspire to transcend that system, right, or to completely understand it. And I think this is still very much present in our contemporary thinking. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope I made some kind of sense. And I know this was probably making your head spin by now. So if you go to that link right there, I just published this morning a write-up of this, which contains much more detail and probably is more coherent than I've managed to be this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vikram. That was fantastic. And my head is spinning, but in a wonderful way, a pleasant head spin. And I hope your head's not spinning too much as well. You're probably a bit delirious after that, but you were totally coherent. And I have to say, I rather wish I'd had that lecture before I embarked on my undergraduate Pāṇini studies. I might have been a bit of a keener student. Yeah. It's raised all sorts of questions in me, but I'm just going to ask one, which has come to me now, and then we'll open up questions to the floor. And I said at the beginning that what indisputably makes Sanskrit unique is Pāṇini, and not only the brilliance of this generative grammar, but the fact that when he composed it, perhaps in his head, which, as he said, is quite fantastic that he was able to do it without writing it down, if he did. So since then, Sanskrit has been fixed. Since then, and that's what makes it totally unique, different from any other language. Since then, if anything that doesn't follow those rules isn't Sanskrit, basically. But my question is, you said that it's proven impossible to do the same for other languages, English and so forth. So that then made me think, but does that then mean that there is something inherently unique about Sanskrit, that Pāṇini was able to do that? Or is that just because language probably hadn't been around that long when Pāṇini wrote his grammar, and that language has evolved considerably in the intervening 2,500 years, so that there's too many influences, there's too many other streams have come into English to make it codifiable. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
I mean, it's an ambiguous. There's lots of theorization been done about this. In other words, is Sanskrit in 500 BCE in a form that allows him to observe these patterns and therefore produce a formal grammar for them? Or is it that he imposes a kind of formalization on Sanskrit, which then becomes the ruling paradigm, the ruling generator of Sanskrit forever afterwards? And there doesn't seem to be any clear answer as far as I can tell. I have to say that within the Ashtadhyayi himself, he seems fairly open to sort of the actual world, right? So he's not operating in some sort of rarefied nerd universe where, he's producing this abstraction which actually doesn't match with reality. For a lot of things, solutions to problems that he gives is for such and such, you should look to the actual usage of the people, right? So it seems to me that he's doing a descriptive linguistics rather than a prescriptive linguistics, right? Which is then, although I'm reluctant to completely tie myself to this position, would suggest that maybe there is something completely unique about Sanskrit.
Thank you. Okay, so now we've got 5 or 6 minutes left for questions. There's a lot of hands up. First one.
Thank you so much for this. Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I would like to ask, how can, what is the relevance of Sanskrit in present context? How can this thing be revived? And is it not true that the West or the Westerners are showing more interest in it than the Indians who think this is a dead language and it's all over?
Those are questions which are above my pay grade, maybe. but I guess for me, the relevance of Sanskrit is that it describes my deep past and therefore describes a part of myself, right? And for some, and for that reason, it makes me happy to engage with it. And so even my recent reading of the Panchatantra has been extraordinarily pleasure-filled and illuminating, right? Because now I'm actually engaging with the ancient texts. I mean, I grew up with Amar Chitra Katha and all of that, right? And those books which always try to like sort of imply that the Panchatantra was like kids' animal stories, right? And when I actually read the work, it's actually not that at all, right? It's like Arthashastra for dummies, right? Animals assassinate each other, they cause political revolutions, and the legend behind the Panchatantra is that there's a king who has really 3 dumb sons, and he's despairing that when he dies, his kingdom is going to fall apart. So he calls in this great sage to teach his dumb sons Arthashastra through animal tales, right? So for me, that was a huge discovery. As to reviving it, I think I'd be quite happy to have it read more widely, to be used more widely. I mean, my friend Arvind Krishan Mehrotra, the poet, was asked by a reporter, should we teach Sanskrit in all schools? And he said, yeah, we absolutely should, because then all the kids will learn about the great oceans of erotic poetry that are present in Sanskrit, right? And so I think for me, an actual encounter with the text would produce a very different version of our past than which is produced by sort of modern traditionalists, right? People who've actually read the text find a much more morally complex, much more sexually diverse universe in those texts than people would have us believe, right? Yes, so the short, my conclusion is yes, Sanskrit everywhere.
Yeah. My question is, how do we know that this is the original thing which Pāṇini wrote? Because there are this Siddhant, Loga, Kamudis. Any language goes through a set of interpretations. And secondly, Western linguists have said that the script at that time was Brahmi. That is their hypothesis. And Sanskrit has been written in a variety of scripts.
Yeah.
So what do you think was the original script in which Pāṇini wrote? And the last thing is, what do you think about the Proto-Indo-European hypothesis, which was, in some sources, it is said to be a colonial project. So I just wanted your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, on that last slide of the stamp, they actually have him writing in Brahmi. So that seems probable that if writing was used, that it was probably in Brahmi script. As to the larger question of Proto-Indian, PIE, Proto-Indian European, I am fairly convinced by that argument that there was some proto-language that then transformed itself as it moved in various directions. I'm aware of the controversy and the opposition to that argument. I haven't, to date, sort of been convinced by the other side.
Lady in just by the aisle, 5, 6 rows back.
Hello, sir. My name is Priya, and I have never read Sanskrit, and it seems quite tough too. So my question is, in order to understand linguistics in depth in English language, is it necessary to understand Pāṇini's grammar too?
No, I think they're quite different projects. Although I think in any upper level linguistics program in the world, Pāṇini is still taught, right? And certainly, like I said, the influence on 19th and 20th century modern linguistics from Pāṇini is so huge that you can't actually do any kind of linguistics without actually encountering Pāṇini's work, right? The word sandhi, for instance, is used for euphonic combination in linguistics texts across the world. But no, I mean, I think trying to study Pāṇini's grammar would take decades, at least at the speed that I go at. And understanding it is quite a tough job. You have to dedicate yourself to it.
On that, I think we're going to have to wrap up now because we've run out of time. I really think we need to give Vikram a huge round of applause for that because he's not very well, as I said, and he's going to have to return to his sickbed. So I think it was a tour de force. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Once again, a big round of